who recognizes this picture, but this is Ireland in the 1970s, the IRA. They were having big problems. They were living in poverty. Poverty rates were through the sky, through the roof. Their unemployment rate was skyrocketing. And around that time, they decided to change things. A small video about what they set out to do. This is in the 1970s, remember.
The computer industry is the outstanding growth industry of the next 20 to 30 years. More and more people are going to be using computers, going to be putting their information in computers. That's the future.
IDEA has been very successful in attracting investment in key sectors, including technology, business services, biopharmaceuticals, medical technologies, and international financial services. And these companies have had a profound positive impact on our economy. Across all sectors, technology is having and will have a dramatic impact on business models and the future of work. And Ireland is to the forefront of developing and attracting investments in key technologies. The idea is now attracting investments from more countries across the globe than it ever has in the past. And the quality of those investments continues to heighten.
So actually, Ireland was in a very bad state. They had a very rural economy with sheep, and now they're one of the main tech exporting countries in the world. In 2016, they were the biggest exporter of ICT services, and if you look at their capital, Dublin, all the big IT companies are established there. So they set out with a vision, they implemented it. These companies are, you can find them in Dublin and all over Ireland. They're clustering. It's not only IT, but you see that other types of sectors are now coming to Ireland because there's a lot of digital power there, and they can use that in their other sectors as well. So it's a very inspiring example. And we have a little dream here also as CEMIA, but also as the Digital Hub Americas, to become one of those islands in the Caribbean. Kind of like Brainport in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, but instead we call it Brain Coral Boulevard. Brain Coral was a name that was coined by Natasha Chatelain, which is Curaçao in Los Angeles, Silicon Valley. Why can't we have a Brain Coral Boulevard, and instead of being in a gray city somewhere in Europe, we can have it somewhere here? Wouldn't that be nice? So, I'm going to cut it short. I'm going to skip this video about the Brainport. What are we going to do? Are we going to choose the blue pill and stay as we are? Or are we going to take the red pill and see what's possible in the digital economy? Thank you.
Oh, wow. I'll take that red pill every day. Let's keep growing. Awesome. Thank you so much. So much knowledge, Andrew. I like the layout of your presentation as well. Comments to you. We are on a roll today, and let's keep it hot like this. I would like to welcome our next speaker. As I've told you previously, when starting out this second day of the Curaçao Export Week, we have over 40 sessions this week, and today only we have over 15 speakers. And as you've noticed, it gets better by the hour, you know, so it's nice to have you with us, all right? Our next guest speaker is Caril Bertrand. She is going to be presenting this topic, protecting global partnerships, safeguarding your business in the global markets. The question we should be asking ourselves during her presentation is our advertising campaign legally compliant? Do we comply with our advertising campaigns when we are promoting our products and our services? She needs little introduction. She was yesterday also during the first day. Caril Bertrand is attorney at law, intellectual property consultant, and trademark patent agent, and provides lectures and training on various legal subjects for companies, government institutions, and the public. Caril founded her firm, Bertrand Legal and Intellectual Property, in December 2013, and services the Dutch Caribbean, the wider Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, the United States, and Asia through her broad international network. Let's give her a hand of applause and welcome Ms. Caril Bertrand. Bombini.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to CINEX and also the Ministry of Economic Development for the invitation to speak a bit about intellectual property in this perspective. I did a presentation yesterday of the legal compliance of advertisements, but of course this is also an interesting subject and very important to bear in mind once we are dealing with protecting intellectual property. This presentation is going to be regarding that subject, intellectual property, regarding safeguarding business in global markets. I'm just going to try to keep it simple because the topic is already a bit abstract. But let's just start like this. Who uses a smartphone? By show of hands, yes? Okay. And who do you own the smartphone? Show of hands is yes. Okay, you own your smartphone. What about a case to the smartphone? Do you own the case to the smartphone? What about the design of the smartphone? Do you own the design? By show of hands, yes. What about the apps, the applications of the smartphone? Do you own the apps? The logos of the applications? The brand of the smartphone? So that's intellectual property, where we distinguish the tangible object from the intangible object, creation of the mind. So this is it. As we can see, there are various intellectual property rights where a smartphone is concerned. Just a couple of them. The trademark, the brand of the smartphone in this case. Patent protects inventions. The trademark serves to distinguish products and services of a company. Copyright regards the works of literature, art, and science. So the design of the logos, for example, would be protected by copyright. Related rights regard neighboring rights, naburige rechten as we know them. So for instance, performing rights and broadcasting rights. And then the trade name, the name of the company, as well as trade secrets, the know-how, and industrial designs. But in the Dutch Caribbean, we only have a couple of the intellectual property rights that are regulated. And so for those who are following virtually, who are not too familiar with our jurisdictions, the Netherlands Antilles no longer exist. We now have 4 jurisdictions, being Aruba, Curaçao, Sint Maarten, and the Caribbean Netherlands, Bonaire, St. Eustatius, and Saba. So all of these territories have their own intellectual property laws, except for when it regards patents. Trademarks are regulated, copyright, the commercial and moral rights. I should say that copyright, the commercial rights regard the right of publication and the right of reproduction, and where it concerns moral rights regard for instance, the right to change a copyrighted work and the right to give credit, the mention of the name of the author. So even the commercial rights are transferable, so you can transfer that to a third party. However, moral rights do remain with the author of the work. So that is something very important to consider, that even though you have an assignment of copyright, where the commercial rights are being transferred, the moral rights nonetheless remain with the author of the work. So you would have to agree to one or the other contractually where they waive the right, for instance, regarding the moral rights. Portrait rights, the rights of image and likeness, that is provided for in the copyright ordinance. Patents, Aruba has its own patents law, but the rest of the entities, the territories of the Dutch Kingdom share a joint patent act. So for Curaçao, St. Martin, and the Caribbean Netherlands, we would look to the Dutch Kingdom Patent Act. Trade names, the name of a company, is not explicitly provided for in the intellectual property laws, but case law has shown on several occasions that the court does accept trade names through if there is a trade name violation, then that would have to be dealt with based on normal civil law. So let's do some trivia. By a show of hands, you paid someone to design your company logo. You own the copyright. Yes, by a show of hands, if you pay someone, okay? And who would say no? Okay, and the correct answer is by a show of hands, no. Show of hands, yes. Okay, the correct answer is you do not own the copyright in principle. It remains with the author of the work. The only way that you may own it is if it is transferred in writing by a written contract. So that's something to bear in mind. Though some countries do have the principle of that copyright, nonetheless, if in the relationship between employer and employee, that you would still have to transfer the rights. Where it concerns the Dutch Caribbean, the 4 territories that I indicated, in that case, then if there's an employee and employer relationship, by law, the employer owns everything that the employee creates, unless parties have agreed otherwise. So when you register your company with the Chamber of Commerce, your company name is automatically protected as a trademark. By show of hands, who says yes? When you register with the Chamber of Commerce, you have a trademark right. And who says no? That's correct, because trademarks are registered with the Bureau for Intellectual Property. And the Chamber of Commerce, they do record trade names, but you acquire the right to trade name, the company name, by using the trade name. So registration of a trade name with the Chamber of Commerce, and if you do not use it, then you are not entitled to a trade name right. And finally, copyright and rights to trademarks and patents are valid forever. By a show of hands, who says yes? By a show of hands, who says no? Now, if I would distinguish copyright, is that valid forever? No, because it's only valid throughout the life of the author plus 50 years after the author's death. So that's something to clear. What about trademarks? Valid forever? They could be, because there's a condition that as long as you renew them every 10 years, then they maintain their validity. So it is possible to renew trademark rights. With patents, patents are just valid for the duration of the patent right, which is in principle 20 years. Aruba does know a petty patent that you can get what they call a small patent for a period of 6 years. But in principle, once the 20 years have lapsed, then there is no more patent protection. Intellectual property is an economic tool. And oftentimes it is perceived that intellectual property is something, a legal tool. But as a matter of fact, intellectual property does provide, and this is very important, a market edge on the rest of the competitor because it gives an exclusive right to use. You decide as the owner of intellectual property whether you will commercialize the rights, with who you will be granting a license, for which territories, for how long, and also if you just do not want to give anybody the right to use your intellectual property. But of course, you can commercialize it by using it more and more. And I like to give the example of, we all know the books of Harry Potter, and those were made into movies, and then there's merchandise, and even a theme park. All of that simply from a book and translated in many languages. So that represents royalties for the author of the book, because there are various ways how they have commercialized the intellectual property relating to Harry Potter. So intellectual property can be bought, it can be sold, rented, licensed, and even passed under a will. And once there is infringement of intellectual property, the owner of intellectual property has some rights that they can exercise. And a couple of them are to ask for an injunction when you stop the infringer from using your rights. So that's why it is very important to monitor how your intellectual property is being used by others, if you have given authorization for that or not. And also to check if it is used without permission, then you can proceed to seize the goods, tangible objects that embody the intellectual property. And we saw an example of that at the end of last week, where several items that were imitating trademarks were seized. And based on that, then furthermore, they can be destroyed. And an important tool to consider is that you can also, as the owner of intellectual property, demand rendering of accounts, rekening en verantwoording. So that means that the infringer has to show, based on the books, where the tangible objects, where the goods came from, how many items they regard, what was the purchase price, what was the selling price, how many of those goods were actually sold, if they were transported to another country, one or more countries, also check and see which countries they were exported to, who bought them there. So it's something that you can track the whole distribution chain simply because it is your creation. You're the one who is exclusively entitled to use the intellectual property. Nobody can force you to use it. Nobody can tell you what conditions to set. So it's your business that determines who you will license your intellectual property to, under what conditions, for which territories, and if you don't want to license it to a certain company, then that is up to your discretion. And one of the parts that oftentimes is forgotten, that based on criminal part, you can also get imprisonment in case of violation of intellectual property. So these are examples where you can see that in case marks have been imitated. You can see instances of sub-day, sub-way. So that's an example. If we look at the one at the bottom under the sign fake, the cool gates, and that is called gates. Oftentimes there are misspellings, so that is a way where you can check and see whether there is a fake product or not. Hides, so is usually tied, it looks a lot like it. And then a police station for police station. So these are just a couple of examples that you can see where there is trademark infringement. So what we are concentrating on during this export week is international business. And there are a couple of forms, but what I will be concentrating on during this presentation is the two scenarios, that you produce local and then you sell abroad, or you produce abroad and you sell local and international. So in both cases, you have to be aware if you own the intellectual property, or if somebody else owns the intellectual property, or if you're using somebody else's intellectual property and the conditions that are set to the use of such intellectual property. In the essence of time, I will not discuss all of the examples, but it is interesting to check and see some of them. The first one that I will discuss is the matter of the new edition trademark. Now, for those of you who like music, like myself, New Edition was a very popular group in the 1980s, and they were very popular not only in the US, but also internationally. And what happened, at a certain point in time, a couple of years ago, the idea emerged to do a tour where they reunited and that fans would get a chance to go to concerts and relive the part of the new edition. But what happened, apparently throughout all those years of success, nobody ever thought to trademark the name New Edition. So it was basically up for grabs. But afterwards, one or two members decided, well, you know, it's not protected, so let's go and register it with the USPTO, which is the United States Patent and Trademark Office. When the idea emerged to do a tour, and the ones who trademarked the name were not included, they ran against a problem because, of course, they were not allowed to use the name. New Edition was registered as a trademark, and the owner of the trademark New Edition is exclusively entitled to use the name. So nobody else could go on tour using the name New Edition. So New Edition had an added value where that is concerned. So all the plans regarding the tour, those could not take place anymore. They could not materialize because they did not have the rights, and the owners of the trademark were not willing to give up the trademark right just like that. But fast forward a couple of years, all has been resolved, and now plans are being made for the tour for New Edition. Another example is Michael Jackson and the Beatles song catalog, and that is something that whenever you have an idea, keep it to yourself. Do not talk openly and just disclose on a need-to-know basis. Because the idea of owning a song catalog, the Beatles, they're a very popular group in the 1960s with very popular songs that are played up to the day of today. And the idea was brought forward that, you know what, if you own the rights to the song catalog, then that will represent a certain value because you're the one who is exclusively entitled to license the songs, be it for a radio commercial, to be used in film productions, etc. And what happened is that when that idea was released, then the artist thought, well, that's a very good idea, and then actually bought the rights to all the songs, with the consequence that Mr. Jackson then was commercializing and earning the royalties from the songs and not the ones who wrote the songs. But fast forward a couple of years, part of that is now has been reversed, and one of the Beatles can still have some of the rights to that. The example I will skip now to Mambo Beach versus Bahia Beach, the end of the 90s, early 2000s. Some of you may remember that Mambo Beach and Bahia Beach, very popular destinations with regard to parties and the whole beach concept of going to the beach, having cocktails, restaurants on the beach. Now, what happened is that at a certain point, when you typed in, Mambo Beach had registered their trademark. They also had a domain name, www.mambobeach.com. And when you typed in mambobeach.com, you expect to go to the website of Mambo Beach, but you were rerouted to the website of Bahia Beach. And that is, of course, not the intention. It is unfair because people who are potential customers who are looking for information on Mambo Beach are being rerouted without them knowing it to Bahia Beach. So that did not sit well with Mambo, and then there was a court case where the judge indeed ruled that there was trademark infringement, there was a violation of the trade name, and there was a wrongful website rerouting, and an injunction was imposed. The final matter regards DC Tax Solutions and DC Tax and Legal, the last being the former KPMG. And this is a matter not to assume that because the rules are a certain way in a country, that automatically applies to another country. Because the first DC Tax Solutions in Aruba, the right to a trademark is acquired by first use, while the right to a trademark here in Curaçao and the rest of the Dutch Caribbean territories is acquired by first filing. Now, DC Tax Solutions had been operational for a couple of years before DC Tax and Legal was incorporated. And it did not sit well because the latter was also going to be active in Aruba. And DC Tax Solutions Aruba also offered services for the rest of the Dutch Caribbean territory. So obviously there is a likelihood of confusion. And it did not sit well. And indeed the judge ruled that there was a matter of trademark infringement and also a violation of a trade name infringement. So that is something to bear in mind, because even the fact that DC Tax Solutions, DC Tax and Legal was operating there and said, well, okay, they started operating first, but still DC Tax Solution was able to prove that they were already operational. And besides that, they had filed for trademark protection. So protecting your IP and safeguarding your business goes beyond the simple registration of intellectual property. It starts with the awareness of what are the intellectual property rights that you are using in your organization, that you have created, that you have obtained from third parties. The awareness is to also educate employees and people you are working with, such as independent contractors, about intellectual property. So all of that is part of the awareness. And after that, once you're aware of what you have and what you may potentially acquire, then you proceed to registration. You register then the intellectual property rights that can be registered. Start first with your base. Where are you based and where are you using them? And then decide, well, if you're doing business with a third party, then you can license those rights to a third party. You have to manage your intellectual property. And that is quite a big word, but simply said, it is just to administer your intellectual property. And with that being said is, for instance, your trademarks, in which country do you have them registered, for what classes do you have them registered, because when registering trademarks, you protect your products and services. You have to know for which products and services you are protecting, you are registering and protecting through a trademark. So it is very important to determine that. And then you determine the strategy. Which are the countries that you're going to register your intellectual property if registration is required? Because regarding trademarks, you have two systems. Either the system of first use, like we saw in Aruba, and the system of first use also applies to Suriname, or the system of first filing, followed by registration of the mark. So that is something that has to be determined. And then the strategy also regards to which business partners will you be giving, which authorities, to what extent, and then also regarding enforcement. Are you going to enforce if there is a violation of your intellectual property rights? If so, in what cases are you going to enforce the rights? You have to monitor use of your intellectual property. Who is using your intellectual property? Has that business the necessary authorization to use the intellectual property? If they do have, did they get that through a person who was authorized to do that on behalf of your company? Where is it being used? So all of that is important to check for. And enforcement is to take action, cease and desist letters, and maybe court action. So these are just a couple of examples with regarding to protecting your intellectual property. So as you can see, it's quite broad. It's not only limited to registration, but it's the whole process. This indicates the complexity of the matter, and this is where it is important to do what we call an intellectual property audit, which we do at our firm. We help to identify what intellectual property there is, who created it. So let's say your company can be the creator of intellectual property, it can be the owner or the user. But what is your business? Is it a sole proprietorship? Is it a partnership? Is it a legal person, NV or BV? So these are all questions that are very relevant. And besides that, if it's a sole proprietorship, let's say, or if you don't have a certain, if it's a sole proprietorship, then the question is, did you create the intellectual property by yourself, or did others assist you with that? Because, for example, in the case of copyright, then you would have that there is co-authorship. So it is not only you own the intellectual property in principle if you have not arranged that otherwise by contracts. So that's why it's very important, if you're working together with someone, always to lay it down in writing and say who has what rights to what is being created. In your company, you can be working with contractors or employees. As I mentioned, the employees, if it is in their job description, then by law, your company owns the intellectual property unless agreed otherwise. But that is not the case with contractors, because contractors retain their intellectual property rights in principle. So there, in order for your company to acquire the IP, then there must be a written agreement. The contractors themselves can have their own employees, or they can have contractors themselves. So you see, it gets quite complicated, but it has to be simplified simply by doing the audit to say, well, are we talking about any patents? Are there any trademarks? Are there any copyrights, trade names, etc.? And then when you go over to your distributors and your clients, then it is to see what authorizations are you really granting them, to what extent, for what territory. So the very first step to protecting your intellectual property is to not disclose. Keep it to yourself and then seek legal advice, and preferably by an IP specialist, because they can help you determine the strategy and the next steps. If we are going to, for instance, to put it down in an I envelope with the IP office, the I envelope and idea envelope, that is really not to give protection to ideas, but you only record the date on which the intellectual property was created, particularly for copyright. Do self-protect. So before initiating negotiations or seeking financial assistance, it is helpful to work with an NDA, or an NDA would help, a non-disclosure agreement in this case, and only disclose on a need-to-know basis, so not more details than is required. And of course, to educate yourself and employees and contractors about the use of intellectual property. The IP audit, as I mentioned, just to determine what do you have copyrights, trademark, patents, etc. Then to do clearance if you plan to register any intellectual property, such as patents or trademarks. Do check with the database to see if it's not something that already exists and already belongs to someone. Because if you do register, then you will be in violation of their intellectual property rights. Check for ancillary matters. So in certain countries, a sanitary registration is necessary. That is for certain products, you need permission to import them into other countries. So you will have to register them with the authorities there. And also, are there any requirements for advertising? So there might be cultural concerns, maybe certain services, such as financial services, that you will need certain authorizations. If it's pharmaceutical products, also that the health authorities will have to give the clearance to advertise. So that is important also regarding your IP strategy. And of course, do monitor and enforce if you deem necessary. So the IP of others, of course, respect their conditions under which you are able to exploit their intellectual property, and also continue to seek legal advice, not only from a local IP specialist, but very importantly, of a specialist in the country where you plan to put your products and services, simply because the attorney in that country is able to navigate the landscape with you and tell you exactly what is required, what you can do, what authorizations, and how best to go about it. And of course, ensure the rights that you want to use, do searches. Here in Curaçao and St. Martin and the rest of the islands, we can do what we call this an availability search, and that is to see, well, is it possible for you to acquire a trademark right if you do go and register, to make sure that nobody else has already a similar mark, because otherwise you will be infringing. And of course, do not infringe or compete unfairly. So how much does it cost? It costs actually as much as you want it to cost, depending on where you want to export to. And there's the strategy for you to determine then in what countries you want to be active and what is the landscape, how much does it cost, and based on that you can determine your budget. I have just put here for ease of reference the situation in the Dutch Caribbean. For registration of trademarks, a total of approximately $1,500 US, that is to secure the mark, and this is for basic 3 categories. And this is the government fees that I have listed here. If you add the pre-clearance search, you would probably come up to half of that amount in addition. For patent applications, for a kingdom patent application that is valid in the Netherlands, in Curaçao, St. Martin, and the Caribbean Netherlands, there's a basic fee of approximately $200 US. You will have to do a novelty search to make sure that indeed it is something new and state-of-the-art, and that can range between 100 and approximately 800 euros, and that is done by the Dutch Patent Office. And the maintenance fees, as from the 4th year that you pay them, is between 40 and 1,400 euros. For Aruba, there's a basic fee of 172. The novelty search is about between 600 and 1,300 US. The maintenance fees are about 300 to 1,100. The I-envelope for Curaçao, where you deposit ideas, you can do it for 5 or for 10 years, and for St. Martin and Aruba as well. So all by all, if you have all of this intellectual property and you want to protect in all of the Dutch Caribbean territories, it would amount to a rough budget of approximately 30,000 US. But that is only if you do have all of the intellectual property and you do want to protect in all of the territories. It is, of course, possible to do an international registration as well. Then you designate the countries where you want protection. It can be sometimes a bit more economical, but you would have to compare it, because we have seen, especially sometimes when you go and do the local filings, that it is much economically cheaper than when you go the international route. But it depends on the kind of mark that you will be registering. So here I've listed a couple of the 10 most innovative economies. So that is based on the Global Innovation Index of 2022. This can be found on the website of the World Intellectual Property Office. And a while ago in the presentation before, Ireland was mentioned, and the United Kingdom is at number 4 for 2022 for the most innovative economies. And you can see that the Netherlands is also listed on this list. Just a quick check. So for which countries specialize in which technologies. So this is also based on the World Intellectual Property Office, facts and figures for 2022. So you can see that as well. And also the applicants in the countries for trademark registrations. So all of this information can be deduced from the website of the World Intellectual Property Office. This is just some goods that were confiscated in the big raids a couple of years ago, where the goods were confiscated in Punta and Outra Banda, and they were subsequently destroyed for trademark infringement. This is just what we are working with different countries, the stakeholders, for policy dialogues to improve the enforcement. We learn from each other, and we can implement them as well. And this was a seminar in St. Martin regarding the IP enforcement. And these are some of the resources for the intellectual property offices, the BIP for Curaçao, St. Martin, Caribbean, Netherlands, Aruba, WIPO, International Trademark Association, etc. And for those who are interested in advertising, there's the galalaw.com website and some of the publications as well. So I would like to thank you, and I hope that you will have learned a bit about intellectual property and what you can do about protecting your rights.
Thank you so much, Karil. And up for the next one, as I already told you, I like to keep things tight. So we are going to call forward Ms. Tayana Mora Ramis, and she will be having a conversation with Ms. Mary Derby. Yeah, I remind you that this is a hybrid event, which means that it is also online, and we would like to welcome our viewers online on the CINEX YouTube page. Ms. Tayana Mora, excuse me, will be discussing, you can take a seat, will be discussing on trends and innovation, and of course she will lead us into this conversation. Tayana, can you please introduce yourself and also introduce your colleague, Mary?
Good morning to all of those here, as well as on their offices and their homes. We are very happy to be here on this new edition of the Curaçao Expo Week. I'm Tayana Mora. I'm from a company called CINEX Consulting. We work throughout the Caribbean region, supporting businesses and institutions, and we represent the Curaçao desk in the Dominican Republic. The Curaçao desk is a service that is given by CINEX and the Minister of Economic Development of Curaçao. We also do a lot of support from services for export in general, but services export in particular through the Coalition of Services of Dominican Republic, as well as the I'm currently the president of the Latin American Association of Service Exporters, ALES, of which Curaçao is a member. And I'm having here with me Meredith. I will let you introduce yourself.
Hello, good morning. I think we had some excellent presentations. I'm happy to be here again in my home country, and I will be happy to keep and have these discussions between all of us here that are present, and also with the audience and those that are online, and sharing the opportunities and the innovative ways of doing business in the region, Caribbean countries. I am Meredith, and I think for the locals, I may not be a stranger. I have been working in Curaçao for almost 25 years, managing the airport here, as well as in other areas, especially in the air transport industry, also in the region, Caribbean region, working in Jamaica, in the small business and medium business sector. I have been representing the small business, advocating as the president of the Small Business Association in Jamaica, representing them on the private sector organization as an executive, also working with the airports authorities and the different transport industries in the region. So that's me, I guess, in a short way of saying things. And I'm here today to try to see how best we can export our products to the Caribbean market. Yeah.
Yes, the title of this presentation of trends in export, when we look at that, we always see two tracks, at least two tracks, right? There are all the developments of the cutting edge development in technology, and we have seen throughout the presentation yesterday and today some of all those changes that are happening. We are in the middle of another yet a revolution in technology with AI, artificial intelligence, which is happening so fast that we cannot even grasp how every day is a new development. So it's really, we are in the middle of a very speedy development. We had one with COVID, force us to look at technology, to use technology in order to keep the supply chains going, sourcing products, keep feeding people and meeting the needs of people. So we can frame the general discussions of those trends. Of course, technology is one element, but of course we're also seeing consumer behaviors changing. There's a new generation now on the driving seat of making decisions. They are now in the purchasing power, the Gen Z. They are digital native, and they are now the ones that are moving into the middle management and making decisions on what to purchase. So if we're selling B2B, we're seeing a change on that. If we are selling to the consumer, we are seeing trends. And of course, when we say trends, we look at Europe or the US or other markets where they are the trendsetters, let's say, the ones that are advancing the pace. We see a consumer, and some of the presentations highlighted yesterday and today, a consumer that is more conscious about their environment and about ethically produced products, and not only the consumer, but also in places like the EU, the regulatory framework is pushing exporters to comply with regulations that showing that the new law of due diligence of the EU that shows our farmers have to prove that they are compliant with human rights and compliance with environmental regulations, that they are not taking down trees to plant things. So it's challenging, because we are saying, yes, it's good that our consumers have that demand and that we have a new generation that is more conscious about their environment, about the impact of climate change, and we're trying to do something about it. But at the same time, from the producer and exporter side, this is more cost for our small farmers and our small producers, more red tape that they have to overcome, and more challenges, more demanding markets. So yes, we can negotiate a free trade agreement and then tariffs come down, but then the non-tariff barriers are more challenges. So there is always these two sides of things, and I'm sure you will highlight some of those challenges in our region, bringing back, because it's easier to talk about the big blockchains and crypto and all those things, and we have them in the region, and we have people doing it. But at the same time, we have a small business that barely have emails, that barely use internet, although everybody has a phone, but not necessarily everybody uses all the tools that are at their disposal. So it's easier to say, yes, e-commerce, and we have more and more solutions. And yesterday we saw the presentation from CXPay talking about how the cost of transactions are coming down, how more instruments are at our disposal, but at the same time, the know-how. How do we, especially the MSMEs, there's a technical barriers, and the MSMEs from our generation that were not digitally native, we have even to adopting those new technology is at a slower pace. and we don't have the staff to do it, or we don't have the resources to outsource everything and be online. So yes, we have the e-commerce platforms that are supposed to be the equalizer, because it gives us the same access that Amazon has, but we don't have the same resources that Amazon has, or the same capacity that one of those big platforms have. And so even if we have the best website with the best payment system, still we have a challenge to break out of all the noise international and to carve that pathway. So these are some of the challenges that we see, but I'm going to pass to Meredith to do a presentation on how you see it in our region and how are those challenges to our region. Okay. Oh, you have to.
I think what we have achieved so far is we could have seen the success stories yesterday during the presentations of those that have already been able to export and have been successful in the region. I think it is important to mention that we have products that are ready, and how we are going to make sure that all our products are able to compete both international as local. We have CIBC, which is the Caribbean-based initiative with the United States, where we can export our products without having to pay the necessary taxes. And the modern way of doing it is through exporting it through internet. Tayana mentioned Amazon. And we have a platform like that with CPost, which is core made, where we can export our products and do our payments through PayX. So I think we have some of the necessary requirements are in place for us to be able to export our products. I took an example. Being in Jamaica, I not necessarily always hear music of Curaçao. But it was interesting to see that we had a live example of a creative industry project or product. And I heard Dream Girl production every day on the radio in a market that usually is dominated by products of the country that I was in. And so it popped out. And I realized that they have used the modern way of putting their products in the market. First, the language was English, combined Spanish with Dutch. It was in a station. They have used the influencers to get their product in the market. They have used internet, social media, and I said they have done an excellent job, because they are the only product that I hear over the radios in that market. So there is a space using innovative ways to introduce your product in the local markets and also in the Caribbean, even though you may not be necessary speaking the other language, but you still can produce in the creative artists, which is one of the industries that the export strategy has highlighted. So I think there is opportunity, and how you go about it. I think you have all the tools. During these days, we have seen that they gave the ICT tools, they gave the logistics tools, transportation, the legal tools, the institutional, the policies, I think are also in place, especially the treaties with the different countries. I think we can upgrade the one with the CARICOM to introduce our products more into the Caribbean market by partnership. I felt yesterday that there is a little bit of need for certificates in the food industry and standards. So on that regard, I think there needs to be a little bit more exercise from the part of Curaçao, maybe by partnering with, for example, the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, or the one in Jamaica, which have a lot of enacted standards that are accepted by the FDA, United States, and also EU, where they are also exporting quite some products. So I think the innovative ways have been dealt with, and also the traditional ways. So the future is interesting to see with the ICT, 5G, and artificial intellectual intelligence, how we are going to go about that.
Yeah, great example of the music. Knowledge, export of our knowledge. Sometimes we think that the experts are just the ones with the PhD or the ones that have many years of experience in a topic. But one of the phenomena that we see nowadays is that anybody that has a knowledge that somebody else finds useful, people are willing to pay for that. So we have the model of online training or memberships or all those others online resources that people are willing to pay for anywhere in the world. There was an example, I don't recall the name of the company, but there is this lady in the US that was raising goat in her backyard as a pastime. And she started posting about raising goat. And eventually, she got so many people interested on the topic, and she's making $600,000 US a year on training and memberships on people that want to learn how to raise goat. And that's something that probably our parents used to do in our backyard, and they know all the tricks about raising goat, and never crossed our mind that that would be something that somebody would pay money for that. And there's a lot of traditional medicines, for example, where people are willing to talk and discuss about. Sometimes it may be that in our countries are too small to have a big base to certain very niche topic. But if you take those niche topic, like raising goat, and bring it to a larger scale, then you can bring, maybe let's say in Curaçao, you find 100 people that are interested. But then, if you find 100 in Trinidad, and 100 in New York, and 300 in Canada, then you have 500 people. And that is an interesting mass of people. You just have to learn your niche very well, and then promote yourself within the areas where that niche is. And that is something that was not available to us many years ago. And one of the phenomenon that happened during the pandemic was that the generation called Generation X, and even the older ones, started to use more online tools and buying online, and because they were forced to. So that means that people with money and capacity to buy, then they were in line, and they wanted to learn, and they wanted to buy, and they started consuming more online. So it's not only the young people nowadays, you have more and more, even older than 65 seniors that are also online, and they are buying. And that is a niche also important that we didn't have before. In fact, in many markets, if you don't have an e-commerce outlet direct to consumers, you are not tested. They asked a buyer in New York, and we took a delegation from the Caribbean last year to the Fancy Food, and they asked, the buyers would ask you, are you selling in the market online, and how much are you selling? So if you prove that your product is people like your product, you don't have to sell millions, but you have to sell that you have a market, that people like your product and they're buying your product and they're recurring ordering from your products. And that is just by itself, doing that is already a presentation card for you in the market. The same thing with music. The first thing that somebody that's going to hire you for an event or represent you in a market will ask is, where are you in YouTube? How many views you have? And if you don't have enough views, not even on your own country or in your own market, they're not going to pay attention to you. So it's not if we need to, we have to. It doesn't matter where your area is, you have to have a presence. The good news is that you can have a presence and you don't have to spend millions of dollars. You can do it organically, and you can have a small budget of promotional budget, and you have recurring presence, but you have to have a steady presence online. So yes, there are business models that there are companies that after the pandemic, they share corporations. That means I could be the legal department of a company somewhere else, and I'm that legal department, and we all together form one company that markets together. So there are multiple ways of having a presence and exporting. A designer can go to one of the platforms and put themselves there and promote themselves and get a steady job, whether that is your main job or just a side business. The gig economy grew during the pandemic as well. So now you don't need to have a big company to be hired from outside. If you just have to have a good service, you just have to show that you have a good portfolio and that you're capable of delivering. So those are opportunities that you can deliver those services from your home country. You don't have to travel to go anywhere. And some people are coming here, the digital nomads, to work from beautiful Curaçao because they enjoy being here. So you don't have to leave home to export. You just have to understand where the market niche for you are, what platform or what niche, and then pursue those niches.
That's correct, Diana. I think the sectors that the export strategy of Curaçao has selected are interesting, but they are wide. And I think with the tools that have been given during the 2 or 3 days, I think it really pose an interesting, say, educational platform for locals to take advantage of and to put their products in the market. Of course, you mentioned the niche, which what we saw yesterday, that a lot of the companies here have selected their niche and are successful in their niche. When you are looking at larger markets, you always have to be very cautious that you cannot deliver. But depending on your product, of course, you can make use of the mapping that has been shown today and select your demand areas and see if you meet those requirements, and then put your product in those markets. But again, it was interesting that the Caribbean market is not necessarily seeing a lot of export from Curaçao. The XP is in all the Caribbean islands. It's in Jamaica, it is in St. Lucia, it is in Barbados, in Trinidad, through an excellent way of putting that in the islands. So I think the opportunity is there, and we have to make use of it.
Yeah, and you make a point, those examples were good examples of regional exports. The regional markets, we tend, in the Caribbean in general, we tend to look up north. So we just look at the US or Canada or the EU. But we have among each other, among these countries in the regions, a lot of opportunities, because a lot of the cutting edge technology that we see that are happening here are just started somewhere in the region where you have a competitive advantage that you can go. But that means you have to engage with those markets, you have to connect and understand. the reality of those markets. We are similar but very different, and we have to understand it's not the same Jamaica, even within CARICOM, it's not the same Jamaica that Suriname, it's not the same Barbados that St. Lucia, so, or Belize or Bahamas. Each one are very different from the others, so different markets, but still, we have things in common and we have capacity. You have capacity here in Curaçao, in goods and especially in services, where, because you have all the language facilities, which you have that above everybody in the Caribbean, because there's very little bilingual capacity in CARICOM or the French territories. So the Dominican Republic has a little bit of bilingual. Of course, Puerto Rico is bilingual, but the DR is bilingual. Haiti, the educated few have the capacity of being bilingual. So you are multilingual. You have the capacity to work across borders in most of the Caribbean, and those are important markets and growing markets. Those are economies that are growing currently. So you can tap into those opportunities.
Thank you. Are there questions?
Good morning. My name is Wilbur Gertruida. I have a very big heart for the SMEs, and I know this week with the Curaçao Export Week, we again have an opportunity of in growing our economic sector by approaching the Caribbean. But the SMEs always has two burdens: the capacity of financing their growth, and the Caribbean. If you are going to some market, you can go with just one visit. You need to keep going in order to look for the opportunities, make contacts, and build some unique relationship. So in order for you to come back in Curaçao and make your plan, your business plan, how do you, as Tayana and Ms. Derby, can give some insights? How can we overcome this burden?
Yeah. I think that it is... Oh, all right. Don't be afraid to partner. Now you have access online, and you can access the different parties that have similar interests. Before I came here, I met someone that is doing Benjamin vanilla essence. And she went online and she found some persons here in Curaçao, and she has formed a partnership without never visiting the island, and through the media, they are starting to export and exchange products. So I think don't be afraid. You not necessarily have to travel always, and if you travel one time, try to find the interested parties in the different islands where you can work with. I see the intellectual property may be posing an issue because it is not all the islands are signatories. And it is important that you try to get your product certified or at least protected in the different regions. Just like you're going to St. Martin, you're going to protect your product, but try to do it in the other islands so that you know what are your risks of going into the different areas, especially when it comes to music and those type of things. But if it is for products, physical products, you can always find a partner. And you overcome that barrier. Logistics may pose a problem sometimes because we don't have direct connections in the other territories. Maybe logistics, ships, airlines, maybe 1 or 2 flights a week, but you may also want to ensure that that is in place. I know a market that just started to grow very fast, which is Guyana, but there are hardly flights, direct flights into Guyana. So you may have to travel an overnight in another country before reaching there. So that may be a little bit at the expensive side. But the opportunities are there.
Yeah, I concur with the idea of partnerships. Of course, to develop a partnership also takes time. And I think one of the things that we can do to accelerate that is, yes, physical contact is important, especially in the region. But also, one of the things that we don't do enough is to accompany, once we have that meeting, how other point of contacts we will have with that companies that we will keep top of mind with them. So we usually don't send regular emails with information. We don't have a newsletter or something that every month or sometimes they will hear from us, because it is very difficult to follow up with everybody all the time. But the key clients, at least we can say, okay, this month, what can I send that person? Just to keep top of mind of that person, to warm up, to keep warm the relationship until that person is ready to do business with us, because it depends on what we sell. It will take months before they need our services or they will do business with us. But meanwhile, we need to use the other tools. And this is where I think in the region we don't do this enough, so that we keep top of mind. A WhatsApp with some information or things like that. So we need to have a map of those contacts and try to have tools that can keep us present. Because even if with the best intention, and we know that, we mean to work with somebody, but we get into the day-to-day, and if we don't hear from them, we forget about them, even when we need them. So, but if we keep top of mind from once in a while, not too much, but once in a while they hear from us, they receive some information that is valuable or something that of interest. Oh, I read this. I thought about you, or things like that. That keeps top of mind warm until next time, or until we need to approach them and say, I have this opportunity. Are you interested? But they already be warm to us.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Diana Mora and Mary Derby, for this panel discussion. I like to say conversation. And of course, we thank you, our online audience, as well as those present, for participating. We are going on a short break for this second day of the Curaçao Export Week. And we will return with some awesome speakers. We'll have next Rashida Gertruida, Guido Royer, and a mini summit that is at 3 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah. We are coming back at 1:30. Yeah.